Welcome back to another episode of Conner Prairie's gardening series. Today we are in the Campbell Garden, right smack in the middle of Prairie Town. We're going to talk about food preservation and how we save some of these things from our gardens, both historically and how you can save some of those things even from your own garden today. And then we're going to talk about saving seeds. We've definitely moved into fall. Some seeds we've saved already, and we'll talk about that, but we'll also talk about how to save some of the seeds that are just coming on now in the garden. That way you can have these same plants next year in your garden, and it's a way for us to preserve some of the old varieties that we grow. So we've got a special guest today. Let's welcome Kevin Carter, who's our food waste manager.
I'm here today to talk to you about food preservation, methods that were used historically that can be used today as well. This time of year, there is an abundance of crops to be harvested. Historically, people would depend on their preservation methods to get them through the winter, as well as into the early spring until their gardens began to produce again. Now, there are several different ways of preserving foods. I'm holding a potato here right now, and we've got fresh carrots. They would often dig a hole in the garden, a root hole in the garden, line it with straw, pack these in, put straw on top of them, cover them over with a board or lightly packed soil. And then throughout the winter and early spring, they could go out and dig up these vegetables, and they'd be in very good shape for use. Squash was very popular and a very important vegetable crop. This squash here, in fact, was one that we grew last year, and we stored it properly, and it's still usable. You want to make sure that you keep the stem on. You want to keep it in a dark, dry place, not in the basement where it might be moist. Another method of preserving squash would be to dry them, where you cut them, you remove the seeds, you can hang them up on the string. We hang them up over the hearth here in Prairie Town, and as long as they're dried completely and you keep them dry, these will last for a long time. You can put them in a plastic bag, but they must be dry, otherwise they'll mold. Another form of drying would be leathers, where a fruit, in this case pumpkin, would be processed to a puree, and then it would be allowed to dry. And again, as long as you dry this completely, if you're doing it at home, you can use a dehydrator. This will last a long time as well. There are several ways that you can preserve apples. Probably one of the most common ways to preserve apples is by making cider. Now, the cider, historic cider, is a little different than what you think of when you go to the grocery store, buy a gallon of homogenized cider that lasts for maybe a couple weeks in the refrigerator. When we talk about cider, historically, we're talking about hard cider. The apples, they are coated with a yeast. Everything has yeast on it. And they would be ground up and then pressed to produce cider. And the cider then would naturally ferment. And once it's fermented, it will keep for quite a while. They would also take the cider and let some of it continue to ferment and sour to make vinegar, which is a very important cooking ingredient. And finally, similar to the squash, they would also dry apples. And these then could be reconstituted by soaking them. They're not nearly as good as fresh apples, but they do make a wonderful apple pie. That we have a historic receipt for dried apple pie, where they would take dried apple, soak it in water, sweeten it with sugar, and then make a pie. You could have apple pie in the middle of winter. Today there's several different types of pickling, and if you're going to get into pickling, I suggest that you do your research. Get online, find a reliable source, find a good book on pickling. There are several different methods. There are quick pickles, there are hot water pickles that require a canner, and then there are also fermentation pickles, where you allow the yeasts in the vegetables to ferment the vegetable. But Historically, they would have used a combination of vinegar and salt and relied on that. And you had to be very, very watchful of your pickles, because the moment they would spoil, there were signs that it would spoil, you would have to just discard them. You couldn't eat them. One of my favorite preservation methods, jams, jellies. We had some folks here on the staff find a bunch of wild grapes, and here in Prairie Town we had some of our interpreters make a wild grape jelly. This would have been a very popular method of preserving fruits as well, raspberries, currants, grapes. Food preservation also carried over into meats as well. Hogs would be butchered in December when it was cold. Then they would be cured and smoked for several weeks. And once the curing and the smoking process was complete, that meat then could be kept at room temperature for years, and it wouldn't spoil. That was incredibly important for folks in the early 19th century. In addition, meats were salted, packed in salt, and in a way pickled. Salt pork was an incredibly important food source, especially to get you through the winter, and even through the next summer until you had your butchering again in the late fall, early winter. Dairy products also had to be preserved. Cows don't give milk year-round. Chickens don't lay eggs year-round. At least they didn't historically. And so folks had to find ways of preserving their eggs. They would store them in sawdust. They would put them in lime. Different methods of preserving the eggs. Milk could be preserved in the form of butter or cheese. Cheese was more of a long-term storage method, but butter, if it's salted enough, it will also stay fresh as well. Now, if you salt your butter, then you would also have to wash the butter out when it came time to use it. You may wonder why you go to the store and you see salted butter and unsalted butter. Salted butter, you can leave in the cabinet for an extended period of time at room temperature and it won't go bad. But if you take unsalted butter and leave it out, it will spoil quickly. So a lot of these historic preservation methods, we can still do at home. I invite you to come out to Conner Prairie sometime and learn more about this. Our historical interpreters would be happy to talk to you about it.
So with Kevin, you've learned about food preservation, but now let's talk about saving seeds. That's an important thing that we do at Conner Prairie, because some of the seeds that we grow in our gardens every year, we can't get from any seed company. Some may be there one year and not there the next, so if we don't save that seed, we don't have it the next year. A lot of these old varieties, only a handful of small seed companies still sell commercially, so we do try to save a lot of our seeds. One of the easiest seeds to save is beans, and we've already saved some from our gardens. We've got the Lenape blue bread bean that came from the vine, some of the vines in Lenape after the deer quit eating on them. And this is one that historically was cooked and then mashed up and put into your cornbread. You put it into the batter and it gives you more protein in your cornbread with this bean in there as well. We've also got this lovely cranberry bean that we grew at the Curtis house this year, the blacksmith's house. It is one of the prettiest beans that we grow, I think. Well, I love beans because they come in so many different shapes and sizes and colors. This bean is round and red, just like a cranberry, and that's how it got its name. But another seed that we have to save every year, now it's a variety that probably is just on the edge of being historic. It is open pollinated. It's called Broad Ripple Yellow Currant. We sell it at our plant sale every year. It was originally gathered in Broad Ripple down in Indianapolis in the 1980s. A seed collector found this little plant growing at a crack in the sidewalk, at least that's the way the story goes, took it home. He couldn't match it up with any other tomato that he knew about, and so it's called the Broad Ripple Yellow Currant. But we save seeds for this every year and grow them for our gardens and for our plant sale. So tomatoes, if you've ever eaten a tomato, you know that they've got that gel on the seed, and Now some people will just dry the seeds as is, but a lot of folks advocate for fermenting the seeds a little bit to get that gel off, and that way the seed will stay dry better. So all you're going to do, I've got a little bit of water in this jar. We're just going to squish those seeds in there. If you want to do other things with your tomatoes, that's fine. Once we've got all these seeds squished in there, I'm going to leave this lid open for a few days. It's going to get kind of scuzzy looking. It might even be a little moldy on top. And at that point, I know that the seeds are all right. I'm going to put them through a strainer, rinse them off well, lay them out flat to dry. Any seed, even our beans, we want to make sure and lay them out flat to dry until they are dry enough that when we put them in a jar like this, we are not going to look back in a week and see a sad, moldy jar full of beans. There's nothing worse than that when you're trying to save seeds. So here are some tomato seeds that we have already fermented, laid out to dry. These are almost dry, and then we'll put them in a jar and have them ready for spring when we're ready to plant tomatoes. We've also got some more things from our Lenape garden. Some of our Puim corn, and this is one that we cannot get commercially. I did see one place last year that had it but sold out in about 2 days. We've also got the Shisapsing corn. Now the Puim corn was used for flour and for hominy. The Shisapsing corn, the blue corn, was more eaten as a fresh corn, but they also had ways of preserving it so that it cooked up quickly in the wintertime. And you've always got to think about how you're gonna, when you can't go to the grocery, how you're gonna have that food in the wintertime. Both in the times of 1836 with Prairie Town and before with the Lenape, you've always got to think about that food preservation. So as soon as your garden's coming on, you're thinking about how you're going to save it for the next year. Now we've got some special plants in this garden. One of them is the lady pea. The Campbells, according to their biography, their narrative, are from Lexington, Kentucky. And if you look at a lot of Southern cookbooks, you can see that influence of cooks who have that background from Africa. So they brought plants with them. They brought ways of preparing food that when they're cooking for these wealthy folks, they are cooking the same dishes, and that's what people in the South are growing up with. So we see, if you look deep enough, you see that African influence on these Southern dishes. And one of them is a thing like a lady pea. It's related to black-eyed peas, but it is a white pea. It never gets that eye like the black-eyed pea. This year was the first year we grew them, and they are so good. The deer thought so too. But we're just going to pop some of them out and cook them up, and they were wonderful. Now I've also found some on the plants today that are dry. So these are the ones we'd want to save for seed. And again, they pop out easy, and we've got these nice round white peas that we're going to save for seed. Another thing we've got in this garden is okra. I know everybody's got strong opinions about okra, but it is one that shows up again and again in the Southern cookbooks. So we've got it in this garden. Now this is one just on the verge of maybe being too big to eat. We're looking for something like this if we're going to save our seeds. Now when we look at the okra plants, we're going to see that there are some that are definitely too big to eat. So we'll save those for seeds this time of year. We'll wait till they turn brown like this, open them up, and we've got these cute little round seeds that we'll save for next year. So let's take a look around the garden. We're going to look at some of the other things that we can save seeds of in this garden. Seed saving is not hard, and there's lots of sources out there to help you through it. We've got some things, plants that are biennials, beets and turnips and things like that, that take a little more knowledge and skill. So start with the simple things. Start with beans, corn, tomatoes, and I think you'll get addicted to saving your seeds for the next year. One of the other things that we've grown in the Campbell garden this year is a Carolina lima. It's a white lima, and it grew to the top of this and then the wind got it. So a little bit of an arch right now, but it's still growing well. If you've got beans, or especially lima beans in your garden, you'll see that when we get to this cool weather and a little bit of rain, they take off again. And a lot of them will grow until we get a hard frost. But let's open up some of these limas, when we pick beans, we're looking for something that's dry and leathery like this. It's well past eating fresh, but that's what we want for dried beans. And even though these are dry, I will still lay them out in a pan or a tray for a few days to make sure that they are totally dry before we put them in a jar. Save them for the winter. We've got our okra that has grown pretty tall, maybe not as tall as okra might get, but it's had some fights with the deers this year. And you can see some of these giant pods. That's way bigger than I would want to eat it, but those are going to be great for seed. So we'll be looking for those to turn gray and brown like the other one that we looked at. Some of these smaller ones are still good for eating. Okra's in the hibiscus family, and they got beautiful flowers. And I've known a few people that even though they don't maybe like eating okra themselves, they grow it for the flowers. One thing that we've not talked a lot about is our heirloom flowers, and we've got a lot of those in this garden. The coxcomb is another one that's very easy to save seeds from. The seeds are, this flower comes on from the bottom up, and you can see it's already started to turn brown at the bottom. And if we kind of scratch that, we're going to get all these little tiny black seeds. And that's what we're going to want to save for the winter. You can do this, or you can just pick these flowers and hang them up to dry with something below that is going to catch the seeds as they drop out of that flower as it dries. And we do dry some of these to save the flowers for later as dried flowers. But you can see we've got the potential of getting lots of seeds from all these coxcomb. Another one of our heirlooms is our blackberry lily. You may have seen it blooming earlier in the summer with a pretty orange flower, but as the seed pods mature and they open up, you can definitely see how it got its name. It's a blackberry lily, because these little clusters of fruit that are going to dry into the seeds look like little blackberries. And we can collect these, dry them, and plant them later. Now, because we've got so many here, what we actually do is trim back a lot of them before they do drop their seeds, because we've got plenty here, but we can save those seeds if we're going to grow them out for another place at Prairie or someplace else. Another seed that's easy to save is peppers. We have got two different varieties of peppers here. We've got cayenne and fish pepper. And the key with peppers is knowing when they're fully ripe, because a lot of times we're used to eating like bell peppers when they're green. That's not a ripe bell pepper. Bell peppers are going to be red. Let's look at this fish pepper. Fish pepper is another one that has African connections that actually came into the Chesapeake Bay area. And it's got its name because they use the young peppers, if I can find one, that are kind of yellowish. You can see this is variegated just like the plant. And they would dry those and grind them up into a white pepper that they used in their cream sauces with the fish. But if we look at this plant, you can see a lot of different colors. We've got some that are kind of orange, but if we dig in here, we've got some that are definitely red. And those are our ripe peppers. Those are the ones that we want to save for seed. And I'm not going to open this one up right now since I don't have gloves, because it is not our hottest pepper, but it is a hot pepper that you want to have gloves to handle or be able to wash your hands right away before you have a chance of touching your eyes or any other sensitive part. But peppers are another one it's not a hard thing to save. Just make sure that you're going to spread them out and to let them dry before you store them away. Thanks for joining us for another visit to the gardens at Prairie. Next time we will look at the full harvest at Prairie. We'll see what else has come in from the gardens. We'll continue to save seeds as we go through the end of our garden season and start planning for next year. We'll gather again to talk about this full harvest, but in the meantime, grow your own garden and come see the gardens at Prairie. Thanks for joining us.